you go. Okay, and then we're live. Okay, there we are. Welcome, folks. Folks listening in. I see some folks coming in there. Welcome. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Independent District Commission meeting. Today is Wednesday, February 15th, and we'll be here from 6 to 8 p.m. Commissioners, community members listening in, welcome to the first meeting of the Independent District Commission. My name is Sophia Alvarez Castro, and I'm serving as project manager for the Independent District Commission. We're so fortunate to have a dedicated groups of folks who will be supporting the work of the Independent District Commission, which include Autumn Carter and Reed Wagner, consultants from Next Strategies, who will be facilitating our first initial meetings and helping us and the commission establish their foundational documents. We're also working with the Flow Analytics team, our districting experts and demographers, and Adam Briggs, the transition engagement coordinator. Before we get started, we're going to do some quick Zoom logistics, so now I'll pass it over to Adam. Oh, Adam, I think you're muted.
I just didn't want to create any sound. Nice to see everyone here tonight. And my name is Adam Briggs. I am the transition engagement coordinator. And I'm also going to be focusing on community engagement and outreach. My notes are actually just disappeared on my phone the moment that I needed them. But just so everybody knows that this meeting is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the commission's website. We have closed captioning and American Sign Language interpreters. Unfortunately, our Spanish interpreters had to cancel last minute, but our meetings will be conducted with both of those interpretations moving forward. Commissioners, please change your chat settings to everyone. That way you can monitor everything that's going on. And community members, you can submit questions through the Q&A. You could, if you go to the kind of Zoom commands, there's a Q&A option, which you can put in a question and we can hopefully answer it for you. I'm sorry that my notes turned off here. I don't know where they went.
Thanks, Adam. I know you captured it all.
Okay, good.
So I'm going to take a quick moment to go over our agenda. Adam, you're going to hit next slide. There we go. Okay, so we were going to spend the first half of the meeting getting to know each other and begin workshopping our foundational documents, so our bylaws, values, and working agreements. And then for the second half of the meeting, we're going to receive an educational training on districting from Flow Analytics and the redistricting partners, where you'll have time for Q&A. With that, and I'll pass it off to our facilitators to get us started.
Hi, my name is Autumn Carter. I am a partner with Next Strategies. We'll be the facilitators, as Sophia mentioned, for the these first initial meetings to get the commission up and running. I'll pass it to my colleague Reed Wagner to just do a quick introduction as well. We're looking forward to being here.
Hello, I'm Reed Wagner. I'm playing second seat to Autumn as facilitator, but also doing note-taking today. I'm looking forward to the opportunity this afternoon to get to know you all and to get started.
Perfect. So we're going to start with some brief introductions from each of the commissioners. We're just going to ask for your name, your preferred pronouns, and a brief overview of why you decided to apply for the commission. Just as I'm getting to know everyone, I apologize if I mix up any names, but we'll start from on my screen. We'll move down the list. So can we start with Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins? And you're muted, Commissioner.
My name is Sharon, and she, her pronouns, and I am a Portland native, and I applied to be on the commission because I think it's some really pivotal work that we need to do to make our city and our political accessibility a lot more equitable across the city.
Thank you, Commissioner. And going forward, I'll tell you who's next. And so Commissioner Shigatani. and followed by Commissioner Fleischman. And Commissioner Shigatani, we're asking
I'm
for
not
your
a commissioner. I'm
names.
sorry. I'm representing Flo Analytics.
Oh,
I'm the.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry about that. Commissioner Fleischman, there we go. And Commissioner Hanson, or alternate commissioner. after you.
Thanks, Autumn. Hi, my name is Steve. I go by pronouns he, him. And I applied to be on the commission because I deeply, deeply believe in democracy, and I see the new form of government that we're shaping as a really great step forward to be much more representative and inclusive. And I just wanted to be part of that process and excited to be right at the front end working with all the other commissioners. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Hanson and Commissioner Wise, you'll be up next.
Hey y'all, I am Marta Hanson, she, her pronouns, calling in from Northeast this evening. And I applied to be on the commission for two reasons. One, I believe just really deeply that equitable processes are just as important as equitable outcomes. So I was excited at the opportunity to be part of an equitable process. And secondly, it just feels like a once in a generation opportunity to contribute to the city that I love. And to be a part of the process with all of you. So really happy to be here.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Weiss, followed by Commissioner Baldini.
Hey everyone, my name is Lamar Wise. I use he, him, his pronouns. I live in deep southeast Portland off of 136. I applied for this opportunity because I was part of the redistricting process for the state, which was a lot of fun. And it was also eye-opening in terms of, making sure that we were uplifting Black and Brown voices as well as voices of working families. And I really wanted to bring that experience to this process as well, because it really is our future that that we're shaping, and so just want to be part of it, and thought I could help out.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Baldini, followed by Commissioner Laurent.
Hey everybody, I'm Melody Baldini, she, her pronouns. And I applied to be on the commission because I love electoral systems. I love electoral rules. I'm a professor of political science, and my research is always engaging electoral systems and such. So my hope is that the knowledge that political scientists have come up with over the years about drawing district lines and the process of redistricting can be useful to the committee. And also, just like everyone else here, I love Portland, and I just want to help in whatever way I can. Thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Laurent, followed by Commissioner Chisholm.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Josh Laurenti, he, him. I'm born and raised and rooted in the indigenous Chamorro Islands of Guam and the Marianas, and I've called Portland home for the last 10 years. In that time, I have lived in North Portland, Northwest, Southeast, and joining tonight from Northeast Portland. And I applied to be on the commission to be able to really contribute to the work of ensuring that our city council is reflective of the full diversity of Portland's communities, and that it starts to really echo the voices of those who have traditionally not been seen or heard at City Hall. So really honored and excited by this opportunity to work together with all of you, and look forward to diving in. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Chisholm, followed by Commissioner Van Ness.
My name is Kari Chisholm. I have lived in 5 of the 6 quadrants of Portland in order of Southwest, Northwest, Northeast, Southeast, and now South. It is a life goal to live in North Portland at some time. I love this city. so very much, and care deeply about it. I work in politics in my day job. I'm a digital strategist. I'm also a map nerd. And 20 years ago, I was appointed by David Bragdon to be the co-chair of the Citizens Commission on Redrawing the Lines for Metro Council. So I have been a map nerd and a politics nerd for many, many years, and I'm just really excited to work with all of you on figuring this out. As Commissioner Hanson said, a once in a generation opportunity to set the stage for what's going to happen in Portland. Thank you.
Yeah, go to Commissioner Van Ness, followed by Commissioner Siegel.
Hi, my name is Edie Van Ness. To avoid confusion, you may see the name Edie Rogaway at times. I use my maiden name professionally, which is Rogaway. I'm not trying to create any false identities. I'm a third generation Portlander. I applied to be on this commission because of my love for Portland and my longtime roots to Portland. And I want to be part of a new Portland, a better Portland. And I'm excited to get to know all of you, and I'm honored to be on this commission.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Siegel, followed by Commissioner Valsauhi.
Hi, I'm Dave Siegel, he, him. I'm glad to join you all. I echo many of your reasons for wanting to be on the commission. I spent most of my life either working for government, including the city of Portland, or as a consultant working for governments as a city planner. I've also worked for cities with the council and manager form of government. I'm very familiar with it. And so I've got a keen interest in improving efficiencies in how cities are governed. And I'm a bit of a political science nerd and map nerd as well. And glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I suspect you may have a number of fellow political map nerds in the room. Commissioner Vasugi, followed by Commissioner Kimura.
Hi, I'm Sohrab Vasugi. Actually, I'm an immigrant from Iran, lived in Portland for over 43 years. And, you know, I started my business here and created one of the, you know, we are a world renowned innovation and design firm. And I've been affected by the ineffectiveness of the existing city government. And I believe that Portland has a lot of potential, and I love this city. And I think that the political thinking and process cannot solve our social issues these days. We need to bring some more creative thinking and to solve problems, and that's why I'm here. So I'm very much different than most of you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kimura, followed by Commissioner Manharis.
Hello, my name is Arlene Kimura, and I am from East Portland. And my pronouns, I guess, are she, her. I have a 2-year-old great-granddaughter who calls me him sometimes and her sometimes, so I kind of answer to both. I did this because I believe in the process and because I had all these people call me and say, please apply, please apply. So I said, okay, fine, I will apply. But I'm very pleased to be working with people here who feel strongly that this is the way to move forward and to get a different set of voices into our political system. Thank you.
Nominated by community. I love that. Commissioner Manharis, followed by Commissioner Sescana.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Can folks hear me okay? Cool. My name is Amanda Manharis. My pronouns are she, her, and I applied for the commission because I think in my career, I've just really developed a fundamental belief that if everybody was involved, we would be just fine. And my true hope in being here is that I can offer space and an ear and just everything that I've learned in my experience to be able to create districts that make people feel like they're truly being represented and that they have an opportunity to really be involved in a way that is meaningful. So just really honored to be part of this process and nice to meet all of you.
Commissioner Saxena, followed by Commissioner Green.
Thank you. Nisha Saxena, I use she, her pronouns. And I am absolutely passionate. I've dedicated my career to and civic involvement to working with and for government to become more accessible, more racially just. And in my day job, I work in the Equity Office for Multnomah County. I've also been involved in similar processes with Portland Public Schools, serving on the Superintendent Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer, as well as the district-wide Boundary Review Advisory Committee. So working on school boundaries as well. So I'm excited to work with all of you, and thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Green, followed by Commissioner Lumley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ransom Green, he, him, North Portland, and I really applied for this as a non-political nerd, specifically because it is such a great and historic process, and I love Portland like everybody here, and I was just excited to be a part of something committed to equity and a sense of inclusiveness.
Thank you, Commissioner. And to wrap us up, we'll have Commissioner Lumley, followed by Commissioner Judd.
Okay, let's try this again. Good evening, everybody. Good to see everybody. My name is Paul Lumley. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a citizen of the Yakama Nation. I've been a resident of Portland since 1987, and I also have ancestral ties to this area. I currently reside in the Gateway area, and I applied to be a commissioner because I wanted a thorough and transparent and inclusive process. I also want to make sure that we had representation east of I-205 and from a community of color. And also I got a lot of pressure to apply from people too. So anyway, glad to be here. Thank you.
Sensing a common theme. Commissioner Judd, will you wrap us up? Commissioner, I think your audio is not connected. Give you a second there to see if you can connect. And if not, we'll try to get you connected and then we'll circle back for your introduction.
Got it. Is that better?
That is better.
Cool. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem.
My name is Dwayne Judd, pronouns are he and him. I naively and humbly applied to the commission because I thought that perhaps my 20+ years of working in corporate America and business transformation teams could be of some help to this political process. Also grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, where we do have geo-based representation, and I've been curious when coming out to Portland and why that wasn't the case here. I studied the history and felt like when this opportunity for change emerged that perhaps I could help. And so grateful for the opportunity. I look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here, for being part of this process, and for contributing your time outside of, I'm sure, all of the other things you have to do. Being able to serve on this commission will make a difference to the intentionality of this process and how we approach it as a group and as a city overall. So thank you. Adam, do you mind progressing the slide forward? Perfect. So in today's session, we're going to focus on explaining and just onboarding. What is the Independent District Commission? What is it responsible for? And at the basic level, how we're going to work. Now, we're not going to get into the details of all of the documents and the founding documents and the agreements that you'll make as a group, because we can't do that all in 2 hours, while also providing an overview of districting and some background there. But we are going to do some temperature checks. We're going to walk through the structures of those foundational documents that you've received in the past, and then we'll focus on workshopping them in subsequent meetings and in working groups. So I want to start by just giving an overview for the benefit of everyone in this room, including the entire commission as well as the public as to what is the purpose and responsibility of the Independent District Commission, which we'll sometimes refer to as the IDC. The IDC is responsible for preparing and adopting a districting plan for dividing the city of Portland into 4 districts for the election of city council members, future city council members. These districts will be geographically represented, which is why we're focusing on districts. The IDC will use established criteria to develop the map and describe those districts as part of the plan it adopts later this year. As part of the community engagement process at a base level, the IDC is responsible for holding at least one public hearing early in the process to engage with Portlanders directly around district criteria. In addition to that, the IDC will be responsible for holding 2 public hearings in each of the proposed districts before voting to adopt a plan. So that's 8. That'll be 8 public meetings in total at a minimum. And a plan does need to be adopted by September 1st, 2023. And we'll get into what happens if this body cannot adopt a plan. Adam? Just as a reminder for the people who were selected and for the public as well, is why all of you were selected for the commission. There were 4 criteria established to select commissioners. Those included skills, having the skills and knowledge required to help the commission conduct its work, having a demonstrated commitment to advancing equity, possessing the ability to support community engagement efforts, and having connections to a variety of Portland's communities. And that's also a comprehensive measure across the entire commission. The commission consists of 13 voting members, 3 alternate members, and 3 reserve alternate members. Alternate members will be attending meetings on a regular basis, and alternate members will be kept abreast of developments. So if there are any resignations or any vacancies that open on the commission, we can have an easier transition. We talked about the responsibility, but again, this body will be responsible for preparing and adopting that plan for districting, as well as engaging the community throughout the process. And then finally, talking about adopting the plan. So 9 or more commissioners will be required to approve and finally adopt a plan. If this body, after 2 attempts, cannot adopt a plan, the most recent version will go to council for their consideration. I'll pause there and just open it to the room among the commissioners. Are there any questions, or is there a need for any clarification on those basic points? And by the way, we can use the raise hand function to indicate you want to speak. Okay, thank you, Adam. So we'll pause here, but we're going to transition into talking about some of the foundational documents. I'm going to provide an overview of documents you have already received, and then we'll specifically talk through a couple that we wanted to open to the floor for any just initial discussion or questions. Issues that may constitute legal questions. So for instance, in the bylaws around procedures, they may be addressed in the bylaws already, but they also may need to go to council for review. We'll just assess that as we go. Or if there are any potential revisions or revisions that folks wanted to discuss today, again, those may need to go to council for further consideration. And we're happy to follow up either in the upcoming meeting or by email and circulate that, just depending on the nature of the issue. So what we're calling the foundational documents are primarily composed of four documents. So there are bylaws that outline the structural rules outlining how this group must work. Working agreements that you'll define together, but we do have a basis to work from that outlines your shared understanding of how you will work together. Your values, a statement of values, which are essentially those statements of principles that will guide how you'll work together as a group and undertake your work as commissioners. And then finally, a community engagement framework, which will outline and summarize for for the public and for yourselves how you will approach engaging the community in this work. I'm just reviewing a comment. And yes, and so here's where we'll get to. So for these documents, the base documents that you've received, there was a question around whether these are model bylaws and what you'll adopt as a final commission. So the documents you've received have been modeled off of existing documents that the Charter Commission worked from and developed over an intentional process. And so given that this body is essentially a follow-on, is building on the work of the Charter Commission, we did want to establish an intentional connection between the two. However, the documents and the agreements you come to will be your own. You can shape them, you can change them, you can add to them, you can focus on the areas that are most relevant to your work. And there are some obvious differences between the Charter Commissions. For some of the more obvious ones, we did do a brief pass to focus those documents on the structure and the mission that's relevant to this group, but we didn't want to stray too much and wanted to give you an outlet to be able to shape them and make them your own. And I will pause there before going on. Are there any other questions about just the type of documents you've been provided or their basic content? So we're not actually going to we're not going to talk about the community engagement framework today. We're not going to focus on the content or the approach to that. I am going to do a quick plug. We're going to be soliciting volunteers for a smaller work group that's going to focus more intentionally on that document so that though you will have some base language that the commission has worked with, this group will focus more on workshopping it within yourself. What we'll focus on today are the structures of the bylaws, the values, the basic values that also map not only to the Charter Commission's values, but those also roll up to the City of Portland's values. So we'll make sure that you have a foundation and a grounding in those. And ultimately the working agreements, some just basic best practices around how to operate as a commission. But again, you are also free to add any components that you think are really important to how you conduct your work for yourselves as a specific group. Okay, so I'm just going to work through each document, provide an overview, and this is essentially this will function more as an orientation, getting you used to the structure, how this will work, and how the commission will operate and your roles in it. Okay, Adam. So there's a lot here, but I'm going to just walk through just generally how the commission will be structured as a full commission, also as subcommittees, and just the basic rules that will govern how you need to make decisions, and the nuances of how we'll actually arrive at things like consensus or be able to assess, like those will be actually worked out. But as a basic, here's how it will work. There will be 4 different types of decisions that this body may face, just generally speaking. More housekeeping, general approving, like kind of keeping the day-to-day moving. So that's things like approving meeting minutes, process decisions. So this will be more like coming to and adopting those final bylaws and documents and establishing committees. There'll be ultimately subcommittees. So there will be subcommittees that will do the specific work, make recommendations around recommendations for things to move to the bigger commission. This is where a lot of the functional work will get done. And in the broader commission meetings, we'll do some of that work, but a lot of that will be discussing, coming to consensus, considering and evaluating recommendations. And then finally, the district plan, adopting the district plan itself. A simple majority of either the commission or the subcommittee will be required to establish a quorum. So if there is no quorum, we cannot have a meeting, a public meeting. We cannot make official decisions. The actual decision-making process will be one that's done by modified consensus. So essentially, if we'll assess consensus, if everyone is on board, the proposal will pass. If one commissioner objects, then we will do a roll call vote and that will be noted in the minutes. The exception to this will be ultimately district plan decisions to meet charter requirements. We will take a roll call vote on that, on whether to adopt the plan. Almost all decisions this body will make will be governed by a simple majority, 50 plus 1%. The exception to that is the adoption of the commission plan. That will require 9 votes. So 50 plus 1, every typical one's 7 votes. And 9 votes in the affirmative to pass the commission. Just a note here, commissioners, you are allowed to vote in the affirmative, in opposition, or to abstain from votes. However, absentee voting and proxy voting are not allowed. So you need to be present to vote. Okay, I will pause there because that was a lot, but are there any questions around how hearings will work and voting will work? This is also outlined in the bylaws. These are pretty set. So just a kind of understanding how the commission needs to work. These are in line with how commissions work in the city of Portland. Adam? So if you thought we were going to go through all the bylaws today, I'm not going to put you through that. But what we do have is an overview of the structure for the bylaws. So for instance, at the end of this portion, we'll be able to take notes. If you have questions, we'll be able to take feedback around anything that you want to see adjusted in the bylaws. But most of these, I will say, most of these elements are going to be fairly standard. That does not mean you have to adopt them. It does not mean they are necessarily set outside of things that have legal requirements, but we can definitely talk about it. So I'll walk through here. The first 5 sections of the bylaws include the creation. So essentially the establishment of this body as a commission with authority in the city of Portland. It outlines powers and duties, and as well as provides and identifies essentially the sponsoring bureau within the city of Portland, who's chartering that. That is the Office of Management and Finance. The bylaws outline distinct city roles. So essentially within that authority, what are the roles? So that includes the staff that are supporting you, some of whom are here today, public notice, issuing that, the requirements there, and the roles of the facilitators. So in this case today, that is myself and Reed Wagner. The meeting frequency, so it establishes a base minimum of meeting frequency that, of course, you can exceed that minimum threshold, but it needs to be enough to get the work done. The starting point in the bylaws leaves 8 meetings. And then elements for how to make those meetings accessible and to reduce the barriers for participation. Establishing the roles of the commissioners, the voting and hearing requirements we just walked through, as well as how subcommittees will work. Those are all under commission membership and terms. And then in the 5th section, just general operating procedures. So many of these are best practices, creating a healthy and safe working environment, how to disclose conflicts of interest if you do have them. Those will come up around specific topics or issues, and the approach to disclosing them is outlined there. We've discussed modified consensus decision-making, which will govern the decision-making process for proposals, decisions, and issues that arise as you do your work. And there's also a section that outlines how to convene remote meetings as well as ensure for public participation. Adam. Thank you. The final 6 sections of the bylaws really focus on external factors as well as kind of contingency planning. Broad strokes, but we'll get into them. Removal and resignations. So removal and resignations can happen in a few different ways. There can be a vacancy can occur via resignation, via censure, via the removal, which is usually a result of censure. And this section outlines the process for how censure, how removal would work, how resignation would work, and ultimately how alternates would take those places to fill the vacancies. the officers and sub-chairs outlines responsibilities. Again, this is, I think, this is an area where you may want to focus on what is the role of the co-chair. So it outlines the terms. The base structure allows for rotating chairs for every couple months. That's a recommended structure. However, you can decide differently. And there's also an opportunity to define what those responsibilities are. Similarly, the subcommittee operations, there's a way to describe, there's probably room there to elaborate on how subcommittees will work. The facilitator's role, I'd say, have at it. We are your facilitators. We work for you. And especially to get that alignment with your working agreements, to be sure that the processes are consistent, your focus and intention there would be helpful. If it's a thumbs up, we're good to go, but please do tell us how we can best serve you. For communications, so you'll want to pay attention to this section as it is stipulated, as it is consistent with legal requirements for the city and in being consistent fulfilling your roles as public officials. You can potentially have communications with interest groups, with the media, and with the public. There are guidelines in there to handle communications. So for instance, disclosing discussions that you're having with interest groups or parties in your role as a commissioner outside of this committee meeting, how to disclose that, what to do if you receive media inquiries, and interactions with the public in similar ways, being able to record feedback and to provide that even if you're not getting that feedback through a formal meeting. There are mechanisms and ways for you to register that and to be able to use that to inform your work as a commissioner. There are provisions for public meetings and records that outline requirements. And then finally, this is its own section, but it basically says you can amend the bylaws. That is in your power. So you will adopt them, but you can also amend them throughout the tenure, throughout the existence of this body, and it's doing its work. Okay, so that's probably the densest section. I'm going to pause to see if there are any, as you were reviewing the bylaws, were there any things that stood out? Were there any things that seem unclear, unnecessary? We can definitely talk about it here. We can also take your feedback and work to pare it down if something comes up later that you'd like to discuss. Commissioner Van Ness, so a request to discuss the bylaws in the next meeting. We will be able to discuss them in more detail now that you've had time to kind of get in the same room. We also are planning to discuss the community engagement framework as well. So you have more time to get all these documents in line with one another. Okay. Let's move on.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure. Commissioner Chisholm? Yeah.
Yeah. Could you define interest groups for us? It says in the draft bylaws that we should report any verbal or communications and copy folks on the written communications with any interest groups. But what's an interest group? If I've got a friend who's just like yapping at me about the maps, does that count as an interest group? What level does it rise to a formal communication?
We can go to the city attorney for a specific definition of the interest group. However, in the example you gave, if it's a friend who's expressing an excited opinion about the maps, that, for instance, that could be feedback that's public feedback, right? Something that you've heard, they're talking to you because you're a commissioner in your role as commissioner, and you can report that back as a data point, a perspective, and it can also inform how you're thinking about it. And then I'm sure that definition might change if that person is also representing an organized group that has a specific stake. And in that case, there might be a different handling of it, but we'll go to the city attorney for a more specific definition in this case. Any other Any other questions? And again, you will have time, you can review, having had this meeting, you'll have time to review those bylaws. You'll have a version to adopt that is yours. So we just wanted to give you the basic structures and orientation. Commissioner Siegel. And
Let me unmute. Yeah, the quick question is, I understand that we'll have the opportunity to use subcommittees to help get some of the work done and some of the more specialty aspects perhaps. And the bylaws also state that there's the potential for engaging non-commissioners in the work of the subcommittee. Is that does that mean advisors to the commission through the subcommittee? And I guess what do you mean by that? And also if non-commissioners are participating in the work of the subcommittee, I assume that they are not voting members of the subcommittee.
I'll take your last question first. That is correct. Only commissioners will have voting, only active commissioners will have the ability to vote both in subcommittees and in full commission meetings. This commission can engage non-commissioners and external experts, guidance, the public, to be able to inform its decisions. Subcommittees can also do that work. So for instance, Flow Analytics is serving as not a public official, but as expertise around districting and will help. And additionally, others can include, for instance, technical expertise from within the city itself that might help to inform this process, and they can be brought into the subcommittee. We can also, as we will today, bring in non-commissioners to, as you said, advise, to inform, to provide perspective on specific areas of interest.
Okay. Thank you.
We can also make a note to maybe provide examples explicitly, just so that's clear. Okay. We're going to walk through the values. I noted this earlier. Again, these are a starting point for how you decide for how essentially your values, just generally speaking, should roll up to the values of the city. And we started with the Charter Commission Statement of Values because so much of their work is tied just inherently to the work that you will do as a body. Again, that said, you can focus on, you can reword, you can just kind of make these values your own, and especially make them particularly relevant to the work you will do. And I will start by saying, the values document is longer than this. The language is not as terse, and it is this slide is just meant to capture the bigger ideas, right? The more specific and nuanced language will show up in the values statement itself. But just at a high level, start with the first three: anti-racism, equity, and accountability. So under the high levels of values of anti-racism, the more specific embodiment of that includes recognizing that the institution, in this case, the city of Portland, holds this as an institutional commitment, that in conducting its work, bodies, members, those affiliated with the city of Portland will work to explicitly address anti-Blackness, to counter institutional and systemic racism, condemn hate speech in all forms, and be accountable for upholding this commitment. Under equity, the belief, so as a value, the values holding the belief that preserving diverse communities is critical for the whole of Portland. That is critical to remove institutional and systemic barriers wherever they exist, and to increase access to resources and services. That intersectionality is inherently a value and provides a benefit to the work we do. That it is impossible to do this work with an equity lens and while centering equity without explicitly acknowledging the state's history of exclusion. And again, you may want to reword this. You may want to focus on today as well as history. That's just a note. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding trust is essential, and doing that using reconciliation and restorative justice specifically is important to this work. Engaging the community meaningfully whenever we're doing this work, and creating a safe and inclusive culture is essential. And finally, on accountability, the first is a bullet point that mostly is a history around why the Office of Equity and Human Rights, sorry about the typo there, Human Rights exists and establishes a foundation around accountability for providing accountability and a foundation for accountability, establishing those mechanisms within the City of Portland's operations. And that this body as a whole will be accountable to the city's residents and members of the body. We'll say this was added after some feedback from the early versions of the value statements across a number of commissioners who wanted to see language around accountability. We started with a fairly blank slate there, if you'd like to add on to it. Adam. The last four are transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility. And actually, before I start, Commissioner Kimura.
I'd like some clarity on this. These values are aspirational goals, or are we evaluating effective goals? Because what I see is a lot of aspiration, but I don't know that these are actually working or working in the way that might be more defined. So is this the values basically just kind of, we talk about the high level, but for me, it's down to the details of what happens when a city employee talks to a community member and the whole situation becomes less than communicative. So how do we balance the values as a aspirational goal versus what we know for sure happens in day-to-day life? Thank you.
I'm not going to answer the question of how you embody them, because I do think that that's important for this group to come to an agreement about how you embrace these values. We'll say that the values should be the statement of your principles, however, and they should actually, to the extent you have the control, so especially in your roles as commissioners and for the work you do, having your values align with how you do your work and having them be something that each commissioner can tie back to, and that the body as a whole can tie back to when making decisions, when approaching how you engage the community, when approaching how you think about this work and what's going on inside your head, things we can't control, right? It should guide that whole process internally and externally as an individual and as a body. But I will say, being able to have these values reflect what your values are as a group, right? That will take the work, and being able to have them actually tie back to the objectives and the goals that you said, the more concrete objectives and goals of the work that you do will be important as well.
Thank you.
Of course. So we'll speak to transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility. And I will note, if you do not want to include fiscal responsibility, if you don't believe it ties most explicitly enough to your work, it's fine. It is not all of the values for the city are included here, but this was one that was a carryover from the commission. But essentially, under transparency, just starting from the basic principle that it is essential for democratic principles. It's critical for reimagining the political process, something that your work is pretty deeply intertwined with. That embracing open data and information sharing is a critical aspect of transparency, and that integrity and inclusion inherently build trust. The communication can serve as a catalyst for transformative change, that sharing knowledge and not hoarding it drives impact, that is critical to listen to community and also provide access to direct access to decision makers. Telling stories is beneficial because it promotes inclusion. And ultimately, embracing a collective voice will unify the city. From a collaboration standpoint, there's a belief within the city and its embrace that we are better together, that strengthening the city's workforce and community ties is essential, and your body will directly engage with as public officials, your body will engage with the public. Civic engagement is empowering. It is important to be inclusive in outreach and public engagement so as to promote institutional knowledge. The idea here is that your work will be stronger for it, bringing in those voices. That having the community evaluate your approach to collaboration will ultimately make you better and promote accountability, and that ultimately everything you do is a reflection of culture and value. And then finally, I talked about this earlier. I don't know if you want to include it, but it is fiscal responsibility. So in particular, this body will not be making budgetary decisions and will not be allocating resources. However, this body is funded and is an expression of it exists with public dollars, right? So to the extent that you are stewards of resources, it's a bit indirect, but the values here are that values addressing inequities and transparent budgeting builds trust, that centering fiscal resilience, climate equity, and the most vulnerable populations is a reflection of values that show up in budgets and allocations, and that it's important to be fiscally accountable. Pause here just before we do the last slide, and after that, we will pass the mic over to Flow Analytics.
Can I offer a comment about the values document?
Sure.
I really applaud the inclusion of anti-racism in this document. There are other groups that have been historically discriminated against as well, including the LGBTQ and people with disabilities. And I would support inclusion of language to that effect.
Thank you, Commissioner. We've got that as a note as well. Commissioner Wise, and then Commissioner Saxena.
Yeah, thank you. I guess two things. One, just clarification on fiscal responsibility. I mean, I guess I would have questions like, well, what is our budget for this project? Like, do we have power to change, to change where those resources are allocated? Or is this just more so the frame of like, with the resources that we have, we're, are we spending our time and money wisely? So like, that's one, just clarification on like what our role is within the budget. And then the second note is that, yeah, you I think kind of pointed out under equity, I would I guess the line around we acknowledge Oregon's history of exclusion and dedicate to rebuilding trust through reconciliation and restorative justice. I guess I'm interested in possibly some more explicit language there, because I would, I guess I have a question of like exclusion of who, right? And I can guess, and I feel like I have some personal experiences to that, and also I would want to make it very clear, and I also think it would be a good educational opportunity as well to just make sure that we're clear there. But that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have that note as well. Commissioner Saxena.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Commissioner Lumley said, and then also add the nuance that we consider things like disability equity, LGBTQ equity with an intersectional lens so that we continue to lead with race when we talk about racial equity and anti-racism, because we know that race underlies all of that. And when we look intersectionally, we know that people like queer folks of color have worse experiences and outcomes than queer white folks, for example. Also, I'm wondering, do we have a budget for community engagement? Do you know that if that's funded at all specifically, or do we have kind of an overall budget
coming off of?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, so we do have a budget allocated for community engagement and community education for your work. A couple of weeks ago, we put out, an RFP closed for for community engagement and facilitation. And that the RFP right now is going through the procurement scoring process, and we should know who that group is that will be supporting our community engagement efforts.
Thank you.
And before Commissioner Fleischman, before we turn to you, Sophia, would it also be possible to provide additional language or more specificity around the commissioner's role and from a budgetary standpoint, and what is their responsibility explicitly, what could fall under their purview?
Yeah, you mean to add it to the bylaws?
Yeah, or not. Let's decide on where it would go, but just to mostly inform this question around the fiscal responsibility. So what does fiscal responsibility mean? It might jump, for instance, more in the values more so than the bylaws.
Yes, so we definitely will want, like as staff, we want direction from the commission on how you would like to spend our funds, specifically around community engagement. And so the types of like where we're prioritizing our funds, of course, we don't have unlimited dollars. So what types of engagement activities you'd like to see, what type of in your engagement, for example, like, are we going to be having different like interpretation and things that cost money, so that's how you'd be informing the budget as a commission.
Thank you. And Commissioner Fleischman.
Thanks, Autumn. I'm wondering could you go back to the first set of 3 values? I just had a question, and seeing them may answer it.
Sure. I'll give Adam a second.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see something specific, and I'm assuming that we're going to come back to these values. So this is kind of the starting point, but something about accessibility. I think we've touched on it in different ways, but and accessibility is a kind of a broad concept, both kind of physical accessibility, but also transportation accessibility, communications accessibility, all of those kinds of considerations, which I think are a really important value in promoting democracy. And maybe they're in here, and I'm wondering whether we'll want to talk about them to make them more explicit. So I just wanted to raise that and come back to it later on.
I think it's a good flag, along with the other notes around where the language can be more explicit or fill in gaps. And so I will say, mostly from memory, that I believe the community engagement, the draft language in the community engagement framework does specifically discuss accessibility, I believe, but it does not show up as one of the values. So that's a gap there. And I'm just going to summarize. I know that we have to get the flow. We won't talk specifically about the working agreement language, but we'll save that for the follow-up session. But just to summarize the feedback that we heard today, in addition to anti-racism language within the values, can we potentially address other underserved communities, so including LGBT members of the LGBTQ community, and those with disabilities. And in addition to that, broadening out to, is there a room for value around accessibility from a number of different standpoints? Building on this question around race and intersectionality, is there balance between specifically calling out different communities that we want to ensure we're servicing and that we're serving and centering in this work? But does that potentially become undermined if we're not leading with Blackness? Is there a way to specifically speak to both of these as values to be sure that we're centering intersectionality, that we're honoring intersectionality, which is specifically called out in the draft language? And finally, can we be more explicit around the language around Oregon's history as a state, how it will inform this work, and say what we mean? Okay. So we've got those notes, and we will be following up with
Sorry, it's Commissioner Van Ness.
Commissioner Van Ness. Sure.
Forgive my, I couldn't figure out how to do the hand raise thing. I'll do
It's
better
okay.
for next time. I tried, but one thing I wanted to add is that I know that I think we should look at when one of the commissioners mentioned budget and where we're going to utilize our budget. I think we should look at some of the work that was done in outreach when it came to the charter process and see what worked and what didn't work. Because if our budget is limited, we want to be sure that the dollars are going to go to are going to make sense, are going to reach as many people as possible. And I was just paying attention as a citizen, so I don't know all the ins and outs, but my recollection is that some of the outreach efforts weren't as successful. And so maybe we should look at a broader reach, such as more of Zooms or remote interactions, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to add that.
We've noted that one as well. And forgive me, I did not note the question around being more explicit around the role for fiscal responsibility and budget. And Commissioner Hanson, you have to be our last comment because we will need to have Flo present.
To your fabulous summary, I just wanted to uplift what Commissioner Kimura had said earlier about aspirational versus kind of actual values. And maybe there's a way we can add that to the accountability bucket of how are we accountable to ourselves and one another, and making sure that these values are not just aspirational, but acted upon.
Thank you. And we will be following up on the process for revising the documents and the involvement of working groups or editing the documents based on your feedback. I am going to throw it to the Flow Analytics team. Apologies for going over. Kimmy.
Sure, that's no problem. I'm Kimmy Shigatani, and I am the Chief Operating Officer for Flow Analytics. We're very excited to be working with the city on this project. I'm one of our team from Flow for this project, and I'll be introducing our team next week, or the next meeting in 2 weeks. And I'm here tonight to introduce Liz Stitt and Paul Mitchell from Redistricting Partners, who will be presenting information on the basics and the history of districting and redistricting. Liz Stitt is a redistricting manager for Redistricting Partners. She served as a demographer and led community outreach efforts on over a dozen local redistrictings, including the City of Martinez Independent Redistricting Commission, multiple counties and cities and special districts. She's currently completing the redistricting in the city of Riverside, which is the 12th largest city in California, with a diverse population of over 300,000 residents. Prior to working for Redistricting Partners, Liz worked for 10 years in the California legislative area of communications and public policy. She's also worked on anti-gerrymandering legislation in Texas, in the Texas legislature. She obtained her undergraduate degree from the University of California in Davis and her graduate degree in public affairs from University of Texas in Austin. Joining her tonight is Paul Mitchell. Redistricting Partners is headed by Paul Mitchell, who's a data consultant based in Sacramento. Mitchell's conducted redistricting processes for more than 100 cities, states, school boards, and community college districts, including the state of New York's Independent Redistricting Commission, the Los Angeles City Council Redistricting Commission, the Long Beach Independent Redistricting Commission, and commissions in Oakland, Berkeley, New York City, and Mesa, Arizona. His firm's work on racially polarized voting analyses and demographics have aided dozens of agencies as they navigate both California and the federal voting rights acts. Mitchell also works with nonprofit organizations such as the Irvine Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Advancement Project, Common Cause, and others in building community engagement and working throughout California and nationally on elections and voting issues, including advising the state of New Mexico's inaugural redistricting commission, working with the State Ethics Committee on guidelines for commissioners, and evaluating their final maps. In total, Mitchell and his firm has worked in more than 15 states around the country, advising on statewide legislative and congressional redistricting. He's regularly cited in the media as an expert on elections and redistricting, including the subject of a CNN Present special on the decennial redistricting process, being interviewed on the PBS NewsHour election coverage in 2020, and participating in the 538 podcast series on redistricting reform, and as a regular analyst on California-based network TV election coverage. For the past 10 years, Mitchell's also served as vice president of political data, where he works with campaigns, nonprofits, and universities with a specialty in polling and survey data. He's earned his associate's degree from Orange Coast College, an undergraduate degree from American University, and a master's in public policy from the University of Southern California. Suffice to say that he knows a little bit about redistricting and definitely a lot about being a data nerd. And so I will happily turn over. In the interest of full disclosure, Paul and I have known each other through two districting cycles, so that's about 20 years. And so I'm now turning it over to Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Kimmy. And I'm going to go ahead and do a presentation that will kind of go through a lot of the nuts and bolts of the redistricting process. It's up to you whether we have questions at the end or if you want to ask questions while I'm going through it. So I'll leave it to you as a group, or Autumn, it looks like you're the facilitator. Maybe you want to help with that if people start wanting to pipe in and ask questions, how they want to do it. Thumbs up. So let me go ahead and share my presentation. Get everything sorted here so I can see everybody. All righty. Great. So I'm going to go through a number of things here to kind of set the stage and go through some of the important things that you're going to want to know through the redistricting process. And I would bet that a lot of these things are things you're going to hear over and over in future hearings as well. There's really no harm in repeating a lot of this because the information can get a little hard to digest the first time that you hear it. So don't feel as though you have to be an expert on everything at the end of this presentation, but if nothing else, some of these foundational concepts will be explained, and then maybe at future hearings, you'll see them in action and it'll be like, oh, aha, now I better understand that terminology that Paul was using. So we're going to go over what districting is and what gerrymandering is. We're going to go through the ballot measure that essentially created the commission and the process, look at the city charter, and then we're going to dive in deeply to some of the traditional redistricting principles, the ways that redistricting is done. And then in that part, we'll get into the mechanics of redistricting and terminology and all of that. So just to start, elections are done in multiple kinds of ways around the country for city councils. It used to be that in all areas you would have districts or ward-based elections. And especially on the East Coast, there was a long history of ward-based elections with obviously a lot of corruption that when California, Oregon, Washington, a lot of West Coast states were setting up cities, they looked back at those ward-based elections and the ward boss structure, and they said, well, we don't want that. We want to figure out a way to have elections where there won't be an ability for somebody and their cousins and their coworkers and their organization to run a ward, corrupt ward structure. So we're going to have at-large elections to kind of dilute the ability for any kind of bosses to develop in the ward system. So in a way, the at-large election system itself was originally a reform to try to create better governance. In the at-large election system, anybody can run in the entire city, and everybody in the city votes. And they might vote for half the council, every 2 years for 4-year terms, or sometimes in some cities they vote every 2 years for the entire council. But the point is that everybody in the city is voting, and the people who get elected generally can live anywhere in the city. Districted elections are an election where and there's varieties of these, where you have established districts, and there are either by area, meaning that the people who run are having to come from one of those areas, or they're electing so that only people who vote are people who are in those areas. And you're going through this initial process of creating the district boundaries, and you're actually going to be using a little bit of a hybrid process with some multiple candidates within one district kind of structure. So it's a little bit of a unique structure that you'll be having, but the process of drawing these districts initially is called districting. I need to apologize. You'll find yourself in the same trap that I'll find myself in tonight, because I'm going to flub and say redistricting a lot. Even though it's your first districting, most lay people would still call it redistricting, because redistricting is the normal term that we use for the process of drawing these lines. So you can call it redistricting, or you can be more specific and call it districting, but I'll you'll see, go back and forth between those. You're going to have these new geographic districts. And like I said, they're going to be a hybrid of elections where you're only voting within these districts, but then also within those districts, you might have multiple candidates. So it's considered a hybrid system that you're going to have. You're going to have 4 election districts, and 3 candidates will be voted in each district through a ranked choice voting method. I can answer questions about ranked choice voting, but I'm not an absolute expert in it. I mostly deal with the line drawing process. The people who run have to live in the district. So that's a part of the process. And voters can only vote for candidates who live in their district. So that's the kind of true, districted election system. The ranked choice voting will allow voters to cast a ballot and rank the candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many candidates there are that have filed for that office. Traditionally, and I presume it's in yours as well, the ranked choice voting method doesn't require you to rank every position, but you'll want to talk to people if you have questions about that who have more expertise in your specific ranked choice voting method. So the first task when going to a districted system or doing redistricting is balancing each of the districts, meaning that they have the same equal population. We'll get into specifics about how that's calculated. But the importance is that you have equal population in districts for basically 2 functions. One is representative power, meaning that if you're sitting in a district and you have a pothole or a street light out or some kind of issue before the city council, that your voice at a city council meeting is the same as everybody else's voice, because you have the representatives that everybody else has. Let's imagine you had a city, an actual example. Let's imagine you were in a community college district in Southern California about 10 years ago. There was an agency that had one district that had 12,000 people in it, another district had 100,000 people in it. So that inequality meant that if somebody was going to complain to their board from the 12,000 person district, they were 1/12,000th of that district. They had greater strength than somebody who lived in a district with 100,000 people. They would have had to go get themselves and 7 friends to have an equal voice. So the idea of representative power is one reason. The other reason is voting power. You want to make sure that everybody has the same ability to elect candidates and the same voting power. And that's where we get into decisions that were from kind of the mid 1960s around one person, one vote. And the idea that districts need to be equal size so that people's votes have the same strengths. It used to be you could have a legislative district where, in California, LA County would have 1 state senator, and then 2 or 3 little tiny counties would also have 1 state senator. And it was completely different populations, but the state law allowed for this disparity. And so we have the idea of 1 person, 1 vote. So districts have to be drawn equal in terms of population. There's also federal requirements that confront redistricting around the Voting Rights Act. There are 2 key provisions that impact redistricting. Section 2 is the idea of majority-minority districts. That impacts redistricting, and we'll get into it a little bit, but it has to do with the idea that if a protected class has the ability to impact the outcome of an election in a majority-minority district, it might be that it's required to draw that type of district. And there are a lot of rules for that. The section 5, the second one listed here, that's an inactive part of the Voting Rights Act, but in some states and counties around the country, they would have to send their redistricting plans to the Department of Justice to get approval. So we are not going to have to deal with section 5. We're only going to have to deal with section 2. So section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has gone through a lot of litigation. There's even cases right now at the Supreme Court that will be decided potentially in the next few months to determine how we use section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act in redistricting. But like I said initially, section 2 has to do with the idea that if you can draw a majority-minority district, and I can talk about specifically what that means, but if you can draw a compact majority-minority district that can have the effective ability to elect a candidate of their choice, and it can be proven that that population is what's called cohesive, meaning that they block vote or they vote together, and that the other population, generally the white population in that district, is voting in the opposite way. So there's a polarized voting against the interest of the minority community. If all 3 of those conditions are met, they're called the Gingles factors. Some people pronounce it the Jingles factors. But if those 3 requirements are met, then you could be in a situation where you're required to draw a district in a certain way to ensure that you're not diluting the voting power of the minority protected class. This is something that we generally look strongly to the attorneys to answer for you. And there can be research done and analysis done, statistical analysis and so on, to determine the actual responsibility that you might have. So legal counsel will look at this, and what they're going to ask is, does that minority population in a certain part of the city meet these qualifications? They'll also look at potential districts that can be drawn, and they'll ask, does this district, the way it's constructed, actually allow for that minority candidate or the minority population to elect a candidate of choice? And they can do things like simulate past elections to see if the minority candidates of choice would have gotten elected under that district. There is a thing called a coalition district where you might have multiple minority groups voting as a block in order for those multiple groups to be able to elect a candidate of choice and get section 2 protections. But overall, the way to think about it is that you are not allowed, based on federal law, to draw districts with race or ethnicity, language origin, those factors, as a predominant criteria. Meaning, you can't draw districts and say, hey, line drawer, draw me a district that has the most Latinos And that's my only direction I'm giving you. However, to create your first kind of like conflict in the redistricting process, if you do have a Section 2 requirement to draw a district to not dilute the minority population, then you must draw a district in a way that doesn't divide that community, doesn't crack their voting power, and you may be required to draw a district in a certain way to achieve that ability for that district to have a majority minority status. So I'm saying two things that are totally in conflict with each other. One way to think about it is that the racial composition of a district is something that you should understand and acknowledge, and the courts have understood that looking at the racial composition of a district does not mean that you're making that the predominant criteria. It doesn't mean that you're breaking the law by just looking at the racial composition of the district. So that's okay. However, if the attorneys come forward and they say, hey, we need to have 3 districts that are over 50% Latino, you might be in a position then to look at race with a little bit more focus and really identifying those, you know, the ability to reach those metrics. Commissioner, you have a question?
Yes, thanks. You may get to this later, so you can tell me that. But how do these principles get complicated by the fact that you have a district where there's 3 candidates running?
So there could be some analysis done around whether or not the ranked choice voting system would ameliorate some of the concerns about the minority population being able to elect a candidate of choice. This gets very confusing because in a general winner-take-all election where the candidate needs to get 50% to win, it's pretty easy to say, hey, historically, this minority population needs to be 53% of the district in order for them to be able to elect their candidate of choice in that kind of first past the post 50% to win kind of election structure. I don't know. There might be competing academic theories on how ranked choice voting would work with that, and whether or not you could justify having a lower percentage of a minority population and still have the effect of allowing them to elect a candidate of choice because of the nature of the ranked choice system. Some people advertise the ranked choice system as being beneficial to minority groups by allowing minority groups to elect candidates in a system that they might not otherwise in a kind of traditional, you know, one candidate system. So that gets into a lot of things where what I would do is say, okay, attorneys, help us answer this. And they might look to academics to try to give you some guidance. But there isn't like a out of the box answer for that. It's an important question. So I'm going to switch into talking about gerrymandering. Redistricting is one of these professions where it's kind of defined by its worst day. You know, it'd be like saying I'm a dirigible driver and somebody goes, oh, you mean the Hindenburg? Like, basically, that's what it is. Gerrymandering, and some academics will call it gerrymandering because it was Governor Gary, and it used to be called gerrymandering 20, 30 years ago. We just kind of transitioned to calling it gerrymandering. It's named after Governor Gary, who was, kid you not, Vice President of the United States and a signer of the US Constitution. But he'll always be remembered because legislators in his legislature, when he was governor, put together a redistricting plan that patched together certain counties in Massachusetts to create kind of a protected district for them. And a political cartoonist made it into this, you know, dragon-shaped thing. This is old timey, and we say, oh, like that stuff never happens anymore. We know that it does. In fact, there was a state Senate district in California that to me looked exactly like the original gerrymander, had a head, it had talons. So it still exists, and gerrymandering is alive and well in the United States today. How it works is a little bit interesting, and this is an example of what you might see like in a political science class to explore the idea of how you can actually use gerrymandering to give a group that has fewer voters the actual political power through the drawing of lines. If I was to give you this or give my 13-year-old daughter this and say, draw 3 districts, this is probably something that they would draw. Some, this or maybe up and down, something kind of logical. And in that kind, either one of those vertical or horizontal districts, you would have a situation where the yellow triangles are the majority of 2 districts. So they would elect 2 candidates and the green would elect 1 candidate. But if the green had a smart consultant that could come in and draw a line for them, they could draw it like this and see how the greens just magically became the majority of 2 districts. And now they have the voting power. That's how Republicans in Republican states or Democrats in Democrat states use redistricting to allow them to have more seats than their actual voting population would suggest that they should have. There are more than political gerrymanderings. The one, really the one type of redistricting that has really driven a lot of Supreme Court cases and really created a lot of the case law around this has been racial gerrymandering. And the racial gerrymandering around the country has created things like the ideas of packing and cracking. We'll get into some of this, I think some more, but the ideas of packing and cracking are born out of gerrymanderings that were done in the South, where they would say, take Georgia and a very heavily Black population. And the courts would look at a redistricting map and say, hey, wait, you took every district and you drew them all in towards the Black population and split them up so that there are Black population in every district, but they're 7% of every district, and they're not able to elect any of their candidates in any of those districts. And the legislature says, oh, our bad, we'll fix that. So then they draw a new plan and they draw 1 district that's 90% Black. And then all the other districts split off to take off the rest of the population. So they say, okay, you can elect 1 representative to the legislature, where even if the Black population was, say, 30% of the state, they could use redistricting in a way to deny them through packing the ability to elect candidates of their choice in sufficient numbers. And so the courts came in and said, no, well, you can't do that either. You have to draw districts, based on these criteria. And if you're packing them in to deny them additional seats, or if you're cracking them to deny them any ability to impact the outcome of elections, then that's a violation of the law. And partisan gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has said they aren't willing to adjudicate that anymore. Racial gerrymandering, that is still before the court. In fact, it's before the court today in cases in Alabama, Texas, North Carolina. And no, not New York, but they're in a number of states doing racial gerrymandering cases right now. Incumbent gerrymandering is another type of gerrymandering that is prolific, which is drawing districts. So, you have a district go down and then it hops over the freeway to grab somebody's house and then comes back in and then continues down. We've seen things with fingers of districts going out and grabbing people's houses. In Sacramento, there was a district shape called the diving board that went out to grab somebody's house. We've seen, many, many cases of redistricting, and it used to be very common where redistricting would start with, give me everybody's address, give me the incumbents' addresses, and then we'll draw districts based on that. So you can have partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, incumbent gerrymandering. There's even a thing that I call amenity gerrymandering, which is when gerrymandering's done to say, oh, I need to have the sports arena in my district. Is it because there's voters there? No, it's because there's lobbyists that come along with having the sports arena in your district. I want to have the LA airport in my district. Is it because you're concerned about sound pollution or air pollution or traffic? Or no, it's because they're concerned about being on a transportation committee or having the ability to get donations from the unions or other groups that are affiliated with the airport. So amenity gerrymandering is also something you have to be cautious of. Somebody coming in and saying, oh, I really need to have this swanky high rise in my district. It might not be because it's what is good for the residents. It might be simply because that's what seems to confer political power to an incumbent. So the districts that have been created will be 4 geographic districts, like I said, with 3 council members each, and they'll determine both who can run because they have to live in the district and who gets to vote on those representatives. That passed just in November of last year. It created these additional pieces, these 3 interdependent changes to the election code. One is that this transition from at-large to geographic districts. The second is what we're seeing here on the Zoom today, the creation of you, the commission. And the third is the establishment of districting criteria. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more.
And Paul,
Yeah.
can I pause you?
Of course.
Commissioner Van Ness has a question.
Oh, I didn't see a hand or anything. You okay?
No problem.
Thank you. Oh, and thank you. The reason I muted my video is because I don't want you all to see me blowing my nose throughout the whole thing. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. This is very informative. I just had a question probably for the staff more than you, but it sounds like because what our new charter entails, we should consult with some sort of elections lawyer or law firm that specializes in these kinds of processes, so that all of the questions that perhaps like Mr. Mitchell and his his team don't know, that we can comply with the Voting Rights Act, and we can have some, because I don't know if you all know what I mean. I think maybe having a legal advisor with this specialty may make sense.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with how you're being set up with your staffing and legal elements, if that's being provided to you by the city, or if it's something that you would have to go seek and budget for. But generally, I am a redistricting expert. I'm a demographer. We have staff. We've even had a staff person who was himself an attorney, but he didn't want to wade into being the attorney for the redistricting. Redistricting can be handled by a general counsel usually, but oftentimes those general counsels want to go out and seek the input of experts who are watching all these Supreme Court cases, really fluent in these specifics, and who potentially even have the connections with, regular demographers or academics who do the type of studies like racially polarized voting analysis and other things to be able to inform you of, any potential responsibilities and how you draw lines under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So definitely having lawyers in the room is very important through the process. If you don't do it right, generally lawyers come at the end of the process, and that's not as much fun.
Right. Thank you. So if we could add that to the future discussion, I don't know what we want to call it, but something like that.
How you'll gauge the attorneys. Well, if you haven't seen Sophia's comment, she did note that the city attorney will be providing access to their legal perspectives, and they're currently producing a memo on the Voting Rights Act specifically for this commission.
Great. In the future, if somebody raises their hand, make sure you have your video on, because I have it set up so I only see the participants with their video so that I can see as many people as possible on the screen.
That's
I wanted to let you wait till the end, but I saw my opening.
Thanks, Otto. So every district is nearly as practicable, and practicable is a term that you see as a way of defining things you see a lot in redistricting stuff. So you don't see this in normal daily life. Districts need to be contiguous and compact. They need to utilize existing geographic boundaries, not divide communities of common interest. There's some meanings behind that, some court cases behind what that means. Be connected by transportation links, which is a somewhat unique criteria, and we can talk about that. And then be of equal population. That is generally considered the first criteria, is equal population. So a hand to Commissioner Chisholm.
Hi, Paul. Could you help us understand the difference between not divide communities of common interest and the reverse? We must put together communities of common interest?
Yeah, so it does seem as though those would kind of be hand in hand. So sometimes in talking about communities of interest, you'll talk about protecting a community of interest. And the idea of protecting a community of interest is identifying it and making sure that it's not cracked in the redistricting process, or it's not somehow split or divided in a way that dilutes their voting strength. That gets you to essentially this definitional term of not dividing communities of common interest, which is essentially the opposite way of saying, I think, the same thing. So I would consider those ideas synonymous and kind of supporting each other. The idea that when you're doing redistricting, you want to identify whether there's a community that is linked by, young people or old people, or people who are near a college, or people who are, of a certain minority group or a certain occupation or a certain kind of socioeconomic status. And as you're identifying them, make sure that you're drawing districts in a way that isn't kind of dividing those groups up. And by doing that, you're ensuring that they're kept together. Another commissioner? The question?
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about utilizing geographic or political boundaries? Like, for example, what's a political boundary? And then also with geographic boundaries, does that mean that we have to use them as boundaries? Like, for example, if let's say the Willamette River is a geographic boundary, does that mean I know we have districts, and like the county has a district that crosses the river. So presumably it doesn't have to be a boundary. Anyway, can you just talk a little more about that? So thanks.
Yeah. So when I see this terminology, utilize existing geographic or political boundaries, I think first off, you can think of maybe a neighborhood as a geographic boundary. And if the city, this is always a thing with cities. Oftentimes there's like an official neighborhood map. Sometimes there aren't official neighborhood maps. The creation of neighborhoods and the boundaries of neighborhoods themselves can be very political, and it can be contentious. And so we've had redistrictings. We had a redistricting with the city of Long Beach that sought to use neighborhoods as the boundaries. From the day we got hired to about 18 months later, when they were done with the actual redistricting, they were making changes to those neighborhood boundaries the entire time. We passed the final plan. The day we passed the final plan, I got a new shapefile for, these are how our neighborhoods are organized. So neighborhoods would be an existing geographic boundary. Maybe where a county supervisor district is split, or where county districts are split, could be something you look at to be informative as to whether or not that's a boundary that you kind of want to piggyback on, or was that put there for a purpose? There might be other districts that overlap the city or are within the city, like districts for a community college board or a school district, the attendance area of a school district, the area of a water district or a utility district. There can be other governmental agencies that are serving the city in different ways, and you aren't required to follow all of those district lines. It would basically be impossible to do that, but you are given the suggestion or added into your criteria the idea that as much as possible, you'll look at and potentially use those, so that at the end of the day, maybe one of your lines is a separation line between two important neighborhoods, and another line actually follows the boundary of where it switches over from being an area served by this one, sanitation district, and it goes into a different sanitation district. So those can be the kind of things that you would consider.
Okay, so utilize really means consider. It doesn't mean.
Yeah.
Not a
as-
mandate.
Yeah, and as nearly as practicable will be, that is giving you a lot of latitude. It's not saying that you have to do all these things all 100%. It's saying you need to use these as ways that you think about and balance the line drawing process. So in addition to the how are you going to draw the districts, there's also a section of how you're not going to draw the districts. You are not going to draw the districts for the purpose of favoring any political party or any incumbent, elected, or other person. So you're not going to draw the district. If somebody comes up and says, hey, commission, please draw the district this way and put me into that other district because I want to run for city council, that's a no-no. You can't do it for that reason. And you can't draw districts for the purpose of diluting the voting strength of any language, ethnic minority groups. So you can't, let's say, have somebody come up and say, there's this one group of people who are in my neighborhood and I don't want them in my district and I want you to split them up, and you can't, I don't think you would, obviously, in listening to your conversation so far, use that as the motivation for drawing a district. So those are two kind of, you may not. Now, the last thing is that additional criteria can be considered as long as they're consistent with state and federal law. And I can get into that a little bit more. I have a hand up, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. I was gonna wait till the end, but I wanted to go back one slide around this concept of communities of common interest, because I do want to make a request that we do spend a little bit more time talking about this in the context of our community engagement framework, because I think the important thing to keep in mind here, and I've had some experience working in redistricting processes over the last 20 years, is that there's an element here of self-organizing, self-determination, and making sure through our community engagement frameworks that we're creating opportunities for these different communities to actually self-identify and to have space to give voice and have some visibility in the process so that we can make decisions, recognizing that everybody should have the opportunity to inform these decisions, but there are going to be areas of conflict. And I think as a committee, as a body, having conversation at the front end about criteria of what we consider communities of common interest, how we identify those groups, how they inform not only the outreach process, but the decision-making process is going to be really important. So I just kind of want to unpack this a little bit and just name it as a request to include as part of that conversation.
Yeah, we would generally recommend reaching out to a lot of the community-based organizations that you probably know are in your area. Many of them probably have already been involved in redistrictings, that have happened already this cycle. Maybe also they were involved in census outreach or other activities in the community that, make that easier to kind of identify some of those, and really do need to have a wide lens for this. I'll give an example, in redistrictings prior to 2011, at the state level, they would traditionally have their set of groups that they would go to, but nobody thought, oh, maybe the gay community is a community of interest, until Equality California and other groups came forward to the commission and they said, oh, we're going to actually recognize the gay community as a community of interest in our redistricting. And that was the first time any state had done that in 2011. And now throughout California, they come up regularly as participants in local and statewide redistricting. And we see more of that. We see more and a wider sets of groups that are involved in the redistricting process than might have been 20 or 30 years ago. So it's a great bit of input, and it is really the most important part of the process. And I have been involved with a couple redistricting where they're like, hey, we're going to start with a list of the communities of interest. And as if they were going to stop. You can't ever stop. You're going to be listening and learning about other communities of interest all the way up through the process. And there is no, like, if you don't have your community of interest in by Friday, that we're not going to consider you. You have to have the ability to absorb community of interest information throughout the process. So the commission's required to have one additional hearing before you develop your plans to consider whether or not you'll take on additional criteria. So what does that mean? You're going to have to look at if there is additional criteria that you should be considering. Is it necessary to consider other criteria? And I'll give an example of additional criteria, a kind of additional criteria. So I've been involved in redistrictings where they said, hey, you consultant tell us that our districts have to be within 10% planned deviation. And 10% is kind of nationally recognized as a safe harbor for how equal districts have to be. Or maybe they say, well, our requirement is to be within 5%. Why not get to 2%? Why not get to 1%? Why not be like congressional districts and have a criteria that all of our districts are going to be perfectly equally sized? When you add an additional criteria like that, it might sound great in the abstract, but when you actually get to drawing districts, trying to meet that additional criteria often comes at the consequence of dividing or creating, taking something out of those other criteria. So adding criteria isn't like, putting additional things on your frozen yogurt where, just one more thing is fine. It really often supplants other criteria. It is hard already to do redistricting and to meet the criteria that you have with all those criteria that were listed. Adding more criteria can oftentimes, make it even harder, exponentially harder. So as you do that, you really want to think about those criteria and whether or not it makes it so that at the end of the day, you're like, oh, well, we realize we had to split these 3 neighborhoods because we had to meet this additional criteria. So be cautious about that is the only thing I would say. There are criteria that have been used and that you should be utilizing throughout your process. These are kind of criteria that are used throughout the country and in redistricting large and small. The first thing is in your criterion, that be that districts are equal size. And that is based on people, not citizens or voters or some other way of counting populations. Districts need to be contiguous, and I'll go over that some more. Districts need to be compact, and I can go over that some more. Need to maintain communities of interest, which is a different way of saying what you have in your criteria about not dividing. And then following local government, other boundaries, and I'll give some examples there. So if you look at the traditional criteria that we see, you have essentially each of these in your charter criteria, just with slightly different wordings. But fundamentally, you're being tasked with doing the same kind of things. And I don't see anything in those that really is a stark difference or some kind of way that you phrased it, which makes it different than what is kind of the traditional criteria. So I'm going to first talk about equal size. So districts are supposed to be equal size for the reasons I illustrated earlier. And the catch is that they're supposed to be equal size based on population. And that population comes from the most recent decennial census. Is the census perfect? No. But it is what you're required to use as the criteria for keeping districts to be equal. There were attempts to try to say, well, we're not going to draw districts based on census population. We're going to draw them based on voters. You want districts to have equal number of voters because of one person, one vote, or eligible voters or citizens. So there have been other things that have been put out there to change what you're calculating. There has been around the country a move and this has been allowed, to draw districts where that population is a little bit adjusted, with prison populations being adjusted back to where they were living before the person was incarcerated. That has been seen as a move to create more equitable redistricting. But aside from that, there have been not a lot of things that have strayed from that idea of districts being considered based on total population. The equality is hard to get, like exact equality, and really very little benefit to having exact equality with a census that the U.S. Census Bureau admits is not is not legitimate based down to the one person number. The census itself kind of shakes up the data to make it not any more statistically significant at the single person number, but they still stand by it as aggregated data. So a 10% deviation means that your largest district and your smallest district are no more than 10% apart from each other. That means that they're relatively equal. Just to dive into that a little bit more, each district will have a deviation. So when you get a map, it'll show each of the 4 districts and it'll say this district is 4% over, this district is 3% under, this district is 2% over, this district's 2% under. Everybody catch what the total planned deviation of that is? It's the 4 over and the 3 under. Those are the only 2 numbers you're going to use in determining the planned deviation because it's the highest and the lowest. And the 4 over and 3 under means that your total planned deviation is 7%. So if instead I came to you and I said, there's one district that's 6% over and the other 3 districts are all 2% under, that would be a total planned deviation of 8, 6 over, 2 under, and the difference between those 2. So the idea is that the difference between the largest and smallest would be no more than 10%, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's 5 over, 5 under. It can be some other kind of variation. There's one last thing to note, and that is that in some agencies around the country, they have sought to overpopulate districts where they think that the census was more complete and underpopulate districts where they thought the census was less complete. So they did this in New York, they did this in the city of LA and other places. The idea here is, let's say that the absolute God honest truth that these 2 areas have 10,000 people each. But the census was very poor, and there's data to show where the census has undercounts. The census was very poor in one area and very good in the other. So now the census says this has 9,000, this has 10,000. So to make up for that problem, you can in redistricting use this 10% variation to say, well, we're going to try to adjust a little bit so the district that is in an area where it was deemed to be more hard to count, HTC, hard to count index from the census, where it was more hard to count, we're going to have that district be a little bit smaller. So it'll be 4% under, and the district where they had a good count is going to be 4% over. And we feel like that's a little bit more equitable. So that's something down the road maybe to look at, whether or not you want to see if those more underpopulated districts be in areas where you have lower population quality, lower census quality. Districts need to be contiguous. Now, contiguous means contiguous. It means whole parts. Something that is entirely contiguous, like a circle, would be considered contiguous. Something like this shape here with a little arm and then like a blank space and then another area, that would be not contiguous. But there's also this idea of something being functionally contiguous, meaning, are these 2 areas, they might be contiguous from a satellite photo, but if you have a satellite photo and you say these 2 populations are contiguous, but you forget the fact that Mount Whitney is between the 2 of them, you're technically right, they're contiguous, but they're not functionally contiguous because from one side to the other, you'd have to drive around half the state to get to the other population. So we've got some maps that show some issues with contiguity. When I first looked at this map, I was like, wait, that's contiguous, but really this purple district here is not contiguous. It has one population here. It looks like it tries to go down like one side of a street there to maybe merge with this one, but then this one is in no way connected to this last one. So you have this purple district D that a court said that's an illegal district because it's not contiguous. This is an example of functional contiguity. The district here, these districts right here are very compact, nice shapes. And then you've got this funky district here that goes and it's really long. But that right there is a railroad track. And there are whole sections from one end to the other where you just can't get from one side to the other. You can only go around. And so if you were to draw a district that was right here in the middle, overlapping this line, it would be literally contiguous from a satellite photo, but not functionally contiguous because you really couldn't get from one side to the other. So another concept that kind of gets paired up with contiguous a lot is the idea of compactness. Compactness is a kind of fancy way of saying good looking district, you know. A not compact district can be funky shapes, lots of, you know, arms and legs, like two octopuses hugging kind of district would not be compact. There are math equations for how you define contiguous. I wish I didn't, there's one that basically, if I had a rubber band where you would take the district and you essentially put a rubber band around it and say, how much does the length of that rubber band around it, how does that relate to the length of the exact borders of the district? So measuring the area of a district and all its ins and outs and comparing that to the same area, but of a circle. So there are a lot of mathematical equations. There's also just literally outlawing funny shapes or using some other terminology like that. Sometimes it's a eyeball test. You can see it. This district here, these districts are not compact. This redistricting was a city in California where, this is going to shock you, 4 council members lived in this one area that was the neck of these 4 districts. And so the demographer drew these 4 districts so that all the council members would still be in a district, but in doing so created a set of districts that a court called a parody of the original gerrymander. When we redistricted to look like that. Those districts are more compact. They aren't exactly circles and squares, but they are more natural shapes and they don't have the same kind of long stringy lines of the original districts. We need to maintain communities of interest. And again, this is the conversation that will really drive a lot of your process. This is something that you're going to hear over and over. There are different types of communities of interest. There are communities of interest where Latinos, Asians, African Americans, other language minorities like Chaldeans or Armenians or other groups can be a protected class community of interest, which you might be required to look at from a Voting Rights Act perspective. And so that should be considered as one set of communities of interest. The other communities of interest are more subjective. And you want to be really open to having as an inclusive a viewpoint of what these communities of interest are and really listen, reach out and listen to get as much information as possible. Now, again, you can look at the racial composition. There were Supreme Court decisions that said looking at the racial composition of districts isn't a violation. It doesn't mean that that became a predominant criteria, but you cannot use race as the predominant factor. And I would suggest as an example that you catch yourself if you want to say, well, I'm going to call that the Asian district, or I'm going to call that the Latino district. Even calling it the district with a racial label could create problems in terms of creating a perception or creating a case record that suggests that race was the predominant factor for that district being, you know, drawn the way it was. So you don't want to talk about districts solely based on their racial components. And you really do want to, as you're drawing lines, identify as many non-race-based factors for drawing districts, even if they're districts that you're being told that you have to draw with a certain racial metric based on the Federal Voting Rights Act. The types of communities of interest that we've seen, and this is not a total list, but it's a good number of things like historical communities. And in that historical communities context, things like redlining, areas that had redlining in the past, you might say, well, redlining's gone. Why is it relevant today? Well, it might still be relevant in how those communities have developed, and looking at maps of redlining and looking at those historical communities can be really valuable. A historically Black neighborhood might still have a community of interest even if it's now changed or gentrified. So looking at those economic interests, the racial composition or racial language or minority composition, other ethnic or cultural areas or amenities, you know, is there an Armenian center? Is there a Vietnamese church? Those kind of things can be valuable in pieces of information. What languages might be spoken? Geographic features, being near a river, you know, being the idea of being near a light rail or a transportation, those kind of things. Places that are more touristy or like a downtown area could be a community of interest. Using school districts or other things like education as a community of interest. It goes on. And we've seen all kinds of things. We've had redistrictings. We had one redistricting where we were using the elevation as a community of interest because there were different tax rates based on the elevation you were at. We did a redistricting where we were mapping out where the almond growers were and where the walnut farmers were because they were different communities of interest and utilized water in different ways. So number of things that can be used in identifying those communities of interest.
And Paul, I'm just going to jump in. I know that you're towards the end of the presentation. Just wanted to name, we're going to go over by a few minutes. If commissioners need to leave, that we totally understand. But Paul is nearing the end of the presentation.
Yes. Thank you very much. So following city, county governmental lines. That is another criteria that we've talked about, I think already pretty much at length. So I'm going to get into some technical stuff. And again, don't feel like you have to master this in just this presentation. You'll be hearing a lot more about it. The census data that you're going to be using for this process, most people, if you're just having a casual conversation with friends or even at a university talking about things and somebody says, oh, the census data, they think of it as one monolithic thing, like somebody just gave me the census data. It's not really like that. Census data has two components. There's a geography of census data, the mapping of all the census blocks and block groups and tracts and all that mapping stuff. Think of that as like a honeycomb that is formed by the census or created by the census to create the units, the geography of the census. Then there's the data, the counts. Those go into each of the little areas of the honeycomb to create the combination of a geographic data set and a population data set. And that is what creates census data. Commissioner?
Who gets this information to us? I mean, if we have a question about people who live in the Park Row School District as a subset or as data set, how timely can the information get back to us? Is what
Yeah,
is
it
the
really
process.
depends. So let me just give you a couple different examples of what it might take to get some data. Neighborhood boundaries. I talked a lot about that. You're going to need to make sure that somebody at the city can help you identify neighborhood boundaries. That person from the city is going to have to provide it to Flow in a geographic format that they can actually utilize. If there's a debate about neighborhood boundaries, that might also be something that needs to be discussed. That can take a long time. If you said, hey, what's the citizen voting age population Latino of this district? Your consultants should be able to give you that in a snap. That should be readily available. If you were to say, what is the percentage of residents in this area based on the census that are renters? That is something they could probably get for you in a day or two, or you could say, hey, in the future, can I get information on renters? And then in future maps or future data, they could provide that regularly. So that's three different types of things. It really does vary. And some of the data is most commonly used in redistricting will really be in the forefront. You'll see it every time you see a map. Other things you might need to, get more information on. And then sometimes I've had redistrictings where they said, hey, can you help us identify the Armenian population? And the Armenian population isn't in the census. So we had to do a bunch of work, and we found that we could get voter files, and we could do surname matches on voter files, and look at birthplaces from voter files and create heat maps to show where the Armenian population was. And that sufficed for the redistricting commission to be able to, make some choices. So there's going to be a variety of that depending on the request. The census, to back up, you've got data, think of the honeycomb. You've got numbers, that can be all kinds of different numbers, but you've got numbers and they pair up so that every number kind of has a home in that geographic space. So it's a spatial and numeric set of data sets. But then to complicate things, there are two types of data. There is point data, meaning on April 1st, 2010, this is where this many people lived. Or on April 1st, 2020, this is how many people lived in this area at that point in time. And we have point data for every decade going back, through all the redistrictings. That is where people laid their head on a pillow April 1st of that decade. It's point in time, one-time data, decennial data. When most people think about the census, that's what they think about. But then in addition to that, the census sends out forms all the time. 3.5% of the country's population gets a census form every year. The census forms that you get that are called long forms, or I call them a long form, they're called the American Community Survey. Those forms will ask you all kinds of things. What's your household composition? What is your sexual orientation? How many kids do you have? What's your drive time? How much is your house? How many bedrooms do you have? Like all kinds of information comes into that. And the census puts out different data sets, the American Community Survey, a household survey. They do a bunch of work that informs business decisions and lawmakers and everybody else, and even redistricting commissions. And a lot of that data is averaged over time. It's estimates. And so the most common data from this over time data set that you'll use is we know that decennial point in time census doesn't include citizenship. And that was a big fight to make sure it didn't include citizenship because we didn't want to discourage people from participating. But the American Community Survey does include citizenship. It asks that question. And from that American Community Survey, the Department of Justice is requiring the census every year to put out a data set called the Citizen Voting Age Population. It allows you as a commission to understand the potential voting rights and implications of districts that you draw by being able to understand the ethnic composition of eligible voters. So it's a really pivotal data set. Probably the second most important data set in redistricting is that citizen voting age population data. What will happen through time is somebody will say, oh, gee, how many people are in that district? And you'll know just instinctively, that's the decennial data. And then in the next breath, they say, what percentage of that is Latino? And you'll know instinctively that that's from the citizen voting age population data. And that's an estimate. So you'll get really good at handling all of this, but we have different types of data. The data set, the geographic area one, the one that I described kind of as like a honeycomb, it's called the Tiger Files. And this goofy graphic was actually something that a reporter found in a Public Records Act request, is a graphic design that they never released, but it's kind of cool. The idea with these honeycomb geographic data sets is that they are perfectly nested geographic areas. There's blocks, which is the smallest unit, not actually the smallest unit, but it's the smallest unit you'll get data in. Then there's the block group, which is a combination of a bunch of blocks. And then there's the tracts. 30 years ago, redistricting was done based on census tracts because they just didn't have the technology to actually do anything better than that. They were using hand calculators and census tract data. We will be able to use census blocks. What's important also is that some of the data comes at different levels. The decennial point data comes at the block, but that citizen voting age population data, it only comes at the block group. So I'm going to show this real quickly. It might, depending on your screen quality, look a little bit like a blur, but hopefully get the point across. This is an area in the middle of California, actually. And all the little blocks with all their little populations. If you look closely, there's some that are 0, 2 people, 75 people, 18 people, 52 people, 310 people. So it varied in terms of how many people are in each of these blocks, but it's chaotic looking. This is like, whoosh, now I feel a little better. This is block groups, combinations of blocks. And each of these might have 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 600 people. They're more manageable. And that is tracts. These are 5,000, 10,000, 6,000, 2,000. These are even bigger, but all of those are all nested within each other. The decennial census file is technically called the PL 94-171. That is what gives you the block geography and the total population data set. The American Community Survey that I mentioned is that over time survey that you're going to see a lot in redistricting. It uses the block groups or census tracts to give you the data, and it results in estimates. It pivotally is what provides that citizen voting age population data. And with that, I'm done with my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I know you guys are over time. I'm not. So if you need me to stick around and answer questions, I'm happy to.
We did have one question. Well, there's Commissioner Chisholm, but I had one from the public that I wanted to ask. So Max asks, how do you handle conflicts between these criteria? For instance, the only way to get districts of equal size is by splitting at least one community. You spoke to this a bit, but do you mind addressing that?
Yeah.
Specifically?
So this is why computers won't completely take over redistricting, because it requires people like you to weigh different competing interests. It's also why we oftentimes say there's no perfect map, because you're being forced to create 4 districts. You're being required to make those districts within 10% population. You're being, as much as practical, told to, well, let's try to follow geographic boundaries. No, let's make sure we don't divide communities of interest. No, let's make sure that we, follow transportation. And let's also make sure that we are cognizant of any requirements under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So we have all these things that we're being told to do. Now, you can't violate the equal population part. There will be some total plan deviation. I don't know if you have a narrower deviation than 10%, but 10% would be the maximum deviation before you could be in a position where a court would come in and say those plans aren't legal. You cannot violate the Federal Voting Rights Act. If you have to draw districts that look like 3 serpents to be able to create one, Voting Rights Act district, then that's what you would end up having to do. So there are some ranking essentially of those criteria. When it does come into communities of interest, you will have, the LGBTQ community saying, we need to have this community together this way. And then a group of people who work in a certain industry saying, hey, that plan that they like, it divides us. And you do have to deal with some of these balancings. Or you say, here's a plan that doesn't divide you two, everybody's happy, but then somebody else comes in and says, wait, why does my district look like a serpent? Like now my district isn't compact. And so oftentimes you're having to deal with those things. I personally would suggest compactness should be your lowest criteria. Compactness and way the district looks is less important than how it functions and how it preserves the rights of those community members. So, I would not prioritize making smaller deviations, because the smaller deviations you make, the more you're likely to have to face concerns about splitting communities. So there's no magic answer to how you deal with these conflicting communities of interest. Just know that there are parts of the redistricting process where you're going to feel really proud of the work you've done. And there'll be parts of the redistricting process where you'll be really disappointed that because of the criteria or because of these conflicts that not everybody was able to, be as equally protected.
So we'll take questions from Commissioner Chisholm and Commissioner Judd. There are a few questions in the public chat too, but we may have to hold and address them in a later session, just in the interest of time. Commissioner Chisholm.
This has been great. Quick question. Is the census block the smallest unit of measurement that we have to use? Or if we say, well, gee, there's a school attendance boundary that's really important to us, but it splits across the census block, we're going to draw our line there. Are we allowed to do that, or do we have to live within the census blocks?
So first answer, somebody asked in the chat too whether or not you're able to split precincts in your redistricting. I'm not sure. Some, like we worked in New Mexico and they were required to follow all the precinct boundaries. I hope that following precinct boundaries can be kind of arbitrary and it makes it hard to draw districts as well. So hopefully you're able to go down to the block. Can you split a census block? The question is this: if you split a census block, how do you really know the true population of that district anymore? The honeycomb, of that census data has now been violated. And you could guesstimate that 4 people live on this side and 12 people live on that side, but you're now losing that connection to the census data. So generally, we want to preserve whole census blocks in order to make sure that our population counts in the redistricting are correct. Now, that being said, census blocks get split a lot when districting plans actually get implemented. Let's say you have a census block that goes up into a mountain range with no people. Does this city or county, when it's drawing the precincts, really care whether or not that area with no voters in it is within this district or that district or whatever? No. So there will be splits, or, there will be places where the administrators of the elections will actually not follow the census blocks perfectly in drawing the precincts or whatever. But as long as all the voters in those census blocks are in the correct districts, then the election administrators are allowed to do that. So if there is a case when you're doing the redistricting where you say, hey, the only way to draw this district is to split this one really weird census block. 10 years ago, we had this issue where there was a census block that was following along a median, and it followed along this median in a way that the city wanted to split a district that otherwise it could, but it was a census block that had 0 people in it. And it was just a census block and a median that created a weird obstruction. And so at that point, okay, fine. Case by case, bring it up with the demographer, talk about it with Flo if anything comes out.
Commissioner Judd.
Thanks. So, Paul, appreciate this. One of the things that I keep asking myself is, what problem are we trying to solve? And I'm sure that as I go through this, as we all go through this, the answer is going to continually change. But for right now, it does feel as if the problem that we're trying to solve is the elimination of bias where bias is ubiquitous. And what I mean by that is if this was a purely math exercise, I think you kind of inferred this, we could dump all the variables, the data, the criteria into an engine and come up with a reasonable curve, right? That would make sense. But that would mean that each district, each community, each block, each household, each family, each individual is exactly the same with no intersectionality, right? With a single partnership to any particular community. And that way you'd be able to generate something that would therefore be, and also that we ourselves in deciding this and inputting the algorithm are free of bias as well. And so it does seem as if, part of this exercise, and you've already acknowledged that even the data, the censuses are inherently biased. They use terms that change over time, and the categorizations change over time. Communities change by people moving in and out. I individually might be an African-American, trans, male, Republican who does not believe in CRT, right? That puts me in different intersectionalities. So how would you then, put me into a community? So I just, what I'm a little concerned is that if we go 1,000 miles deep, we're not still going to hit the right answer. And so what's the right altitude with this? What's the right altitude, right? First of all, am I thinking about this right in terms of what this right now, in terms of what the problem is we're trying to solve, and some of the challenges that we have?
That's a big question. And, you know, it does also get to the idea that there's kind of no perfect redistricting map, no perfect process. Because what you'll likely find in this process is that you're doing a redistricting, trying to achieve certain goals, whether it's geographic diversity of the council members, being able to ensure communities of interest are able to elect candidates of their choice, making sure that there's a balance when you look at the final composition of the city council and you can say, okay, yeah, that does reflect the choices of our community, and no voices were kind of left out because the way the lines were drawn. I think the voters have decided that certain voices are left out in the at-large election system. And so it's kind of like, well, let's try this. And it is, I would characterize it somewhat experimental, because you're doing both the districting and the ranked choice voting at the same time in hopes of trying to address a lot of these concerns that probably have been, you know, put out there by individuals and organizations and obviously the voters. And you will have circumstances where, yes, you can look at an area and you can say that area has, you know, a large transgender population, but they also have affluent homeowners. Are they an affluent homeowner neighborhood, or are they a LGBTQ neighborhood? Are they a neighborhood that's defined by that light rail that cuts right between them? Or are they a neighborhood defined by the fact that they have careers that are in the same business, or that they have the same number of bedrooms in all of their houses, or their houses were built in the same year? Like, there are so many ways to define communities of interest in the redistricting process that your job really is to listen to all of this and, you know, make these judgments the best you can with the information you have at the time. And you might, at the end of this process, I would suggest that at the end of the process, you do a report for yourselves and also for future commissions to say, these are the ways that we looked at the districting. These are the ways that we felt that we, you know, drew these lines and why, and even giving recommendations to future commissions. And the next commission in 10 years will come forward and they might say, hey, that commission was great, but we found through the districts that they drew that there was this persistent underperformance of this one community. And so as we draw the districts, we're going to try to make up for any deficiencies in the last redistricting process. So it's going to be imperfect. There will be things 2-4 years from now, you're going to look back and say, oh, I wish I had done that differently. But I guarantee you it's better than, you know, giving the elected officials the ability to just draw the districts however they want based on some other criteria that isn't part of a public process, you know? So I think it's one of these things to embrace it and understand that it's not going to be everything, you know?
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the redistricting partners and Flow Analytics teams. In the interest of time, that'll be the last question that we'll take for the night. I'm sure everyone needs that time home, but we will be following up with additional information via email. And then any other questions that may come up for you tonight or in the coming days, please direct them to Sophia. And we'll also be following up with next steps for subsequent meetings, including the foundational documents we talked about. And if you're interested in joining the community engagement work group, please send an email to Sophia and we'll coordinate around scheduling those sessions. Okay, and then finally, thank you to all of you, commissioners, for your time, for the intentionality that's come through the questions and the discussions. And thank you for the work. Looking forward to working with you all. And with that, we will adjourn.
Thank you.